Welcome, everyone, to the 33rd in our Middle Eastern Islamic History series. There are 32 other episodes that you're free to watch on YouTube or on our website, Omnicarta. And this web episode is the Maghreb in the 19th century. For those who are unaware, the Maghreb is the region of Northwest Africa. The word in Arabic comes from ghurub, which means the sunset. So, right, it was the place in the Arab world where the sun set, because it was the furthest west. And the rules, for those of you who are not familiar, I am not an academic. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the doctrines that we will be discussing today. I'm a layperson, and I hope that I can communicate to you what I understand and how I understand these topics that we're going to be discussing today. And I'm going to do so from a secular perspective. There are going to be religious elements, certainly, to what we discuss today, but I want to really try and address this from a historical perspective more than a religious one. The next thing is that because these topics are sensitive, I ask everybody to be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. I love questions, comments, clarifications. If you have a question, comment, or clarification, please put it in the chat. I do read the chat while I'm doing the presentation, and will answer your questions in due time. And what I like to say is that these meetings, these classes are 101s and 201s. And what I mean by that is that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up on the basics. And if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. And one thing that I've noticed, because I've gotten a few questions about it, when I put dates in a parenthetical for a person, that's not their life, that's their date of service in whatever position they've been holding, whether it's president, grand vizier, king, emperor, whatever. It's the dates that are relevant for them. And I have what I call a 2-hour hard stop, which means that if we don't cover all the slides within 2 hours, don't worry, I just stop right there and we'll pick it up next week. So you have a sort of an understanding from me that this is not going to go past 9 p.m. Eastern time in terms of new material. Of course, if we have questions and we have a great discussion, we can continue a little bit after that, but there will be no new material after that 2 hours. And finally, as I said, this series, of which this is the 33rd entry, is all recorded. You can go back and watch previous episodes. This episode as well will be recorded, and you can watch it and see the trajectory through all of the episodes, going all the way back to Muhammad and the founding of Islam in the Middle East, and even before that a little bit. All right, and for those of you who've been following along, this is the quiz where I asked to see what you remember from last week when we talked about Morocco moving from the Saadians to the present day, and we also finished up our discussion on the Tanzimat reform period in the Ottoman Empire. So question number 1, which statement accurately explains why tax farming, iltizam, was abolished? Is it A, was a need to conscript the population into the army, so an individualized tax system was necessary to find potential soldiers? B, there were wide-scale revolts against tax farmers throughout the Ottoman Empire based on the idea of popular revolution? C, given the difficulty of fighting Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt, Multazims resigned their posts and the system was collapsing? And D, it was economically unsuccessful, leading to massive economic shortfalls within the Ottoman Empire. The answer is A. So one of the things about tax farming is that the system worked in that the tax farmer would have a credit, and they would be required to pay a certain amount of tax representing a certain region or certain area. So the Ottoman Empire didn't actually have good census records from about the mid-1500s until the early 1800s because of this tax farming system. But if you don't have a good population estimate, you can't do conscription because you don't know how many people there are to conscript. So the tax farming system was abolished in order to get a proper census read on the population. And once that had been done for the purpose of conscription, you could directly tax the people and therefore recoup a larger percentage of the local wealth, right? You have fewer losses in transmission. And so the answer is A. B is false. There weren't a wide-scale revolts against tax farmers. There were some tax farmers who were thoroughly disliked. But by and large, tax farmers found a way to make their people like them because it was in the tax farmers' interest to build the local economies. They got to take off the top. C is false. The Multazims didn't resign their posts. They were forced out of them. And D, it was economically successful for the period that it was implemented. As I said, the only reason that it was dropped was the increasing centralization and bureaucratization of the Ottoman Empire with regards to taxes and conscription. All right, question number 2. What made the Majella so unique? Is it A, it represented the vision of Namik Kemal and other Ottomanists in creating an Ottoman national identity? B, it was the first codification of the Islamic Sharia into an easily applicable legal system for all Ottoman subjects. C, it gave women and minorities key rights over Muslims, making the Ottoman Empire more advanced on human rights than Europe. D, it formed the basis of modern law in the Ottoman Empire and was retained because of its modernity in the Republic of Turkey. The answer here is B. The Majella was the first codification of the Islamic Sharia into an applicable legal system for all Ottoman subjects. The Sharia was a case law system, and what the Majella did is it turned it into a French legal code style system that could be easily read and interpreted by judges who had very little training in the Sharia and were very unfamiliar with the cases. They could simply go to the law. The other answers are false for the following reasons. A is false because Namik Kemal didn't have a national identity that was codified in the Majella. He wrote numerous plays and poetry that codified his national vision, how he understood Ottomanism. And if he had wanted the Islamic law to become part of the Ottoman Empire, he would have wanted it in a far less direct way than the Majella did. He would have wanted it to be sort of like a spiritual basis of the law, in the same way that many conservative Christians who are not evangelical want Christianity to somehow be a moral basis for American law. C is false. Women and minorities were not given key rights over Muslims. They were given key rights that paralleled those of Muslims, especially minorities. Women were not given those kinds of rights. And the advancement of women really only comes during Ataturk and the creation of the Republic of Turkey. The Majella did not improve women's rights. And D is false because the Majella, being a religious law, was not carried into the Republic of Turkey. The Republic of Turkey has actually made Sharia illegal within its borders starting in 1924. So the Majella, being a codification of the Sharia, was made illegal. All right. Question number 3. Which of the following accurately describes the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878? A, following a large-scale siege at Sevastopol by a British, French, and Ottoman coalition, the Russians surrendered and destroyed their fleet on the Black Sea. B, after key battles in Akhaltsikhe and Akhalkalaki, the Ottoman Empire and Qajar Persia surrendered the South Caucasus to Russia. C, the Russians supported a Cossack revolt against the Ottoman vassal of the Crimean Khanate, along with naval support for the Cleft revolts in Greece. Or D, key victories over the Ottomans in the Battle of the Shipka Pass and the Battle of Kars secured a Russian victory confirmed in the Treaty of San Stefano. And we have a guess of D. D is the correct answer. Great job, John. Number A is a description of the Crimean War. B is a description of the Russo-Turkish War of 1829 and the Russo-Qajar War of 1828, sort of folded together. C is sort of a made-up hybrid of a number of the Russo-Turkish wars. Probably Küçük Kaynarca comes closest to that. And D, of course, is the correct answer. All right. Question number 4. Which statements about Ahmad al-Mansur are true? Choose all that apply. A, he began to support corsair fleets with Yan Yansun as naval chief. He built a strong palace in Marrakesh, the Al-Badiya Palace. He launched a successful war against the Songhai using English guns and arquebuses, leading to the annexation of the Niger Bend to Morocco. He was the longest reigning monarch in Moroccan history. And he ascended to power due to the civil war between Muhammad II and Abdelmalik I, which killed both men in the Battle of Al-Qasr Kibir. We've got D, E, and A. D is not correct. E is correct. And A is not correct. E does sound familiar because E is correct. So the correct answers here are B, C, and E. The Corsair fleets with Yan Yan Sun really began during the Republic of Saleh, which came after Ahmad al-Mansur was in power. And we also see the longest reigning monarch in Moroccan history is Ismail, who reigned for 55 years. Ahmad al-Mansur did have a long reign. He reigned from 1578 to 1603, but that's still nowhere close to that 55-year reign of Mullah Ismail. B is correct. He built that al-Badi Palace, which is an amazing architectural monument that still survives in Marrakesh to this day. He did launch that successful war against the Songhai. We talked about the Battle of Tondibi, where the Songhai used cows to try and scare the Moroccans. It did not work. And we talked about the Battle of Al-Qasr Kibir, which not only killed both of the contending Moroccan monarchs, but also killed the king of Portugal, leading to that country having a succession crisis 2 years later. All right. And finally, question number 5. Which 3 of the following are achievements of Mullah Ismail? A, he formed the Abid al-Bukhari, an army of West African slaves modeled on the Janissaries. B, he was able to achieve a strong military alliance with French King Louis XIV, the Sun King. C, he was able to coordinate with the Habsburg dynasty in Austria to launch joint attacks on the Ottoman Empire. D, he built the royal city of Meknes, including its imperial Kasbah. E, despite low virility and near infertility, Mullah Ismail fathered 2 sons. F, he expelled the English and Spanish from several northern coastal cities. All right, so we've got A and D, right? 2 correct answers. The 3rd correct answer is F. So let's talk a little bit about these. The Abid al-Bukhari, we mentioned, those were his slave armies that he used to assert control and were only finally removed from power by Sidi Muhammad. We then have D, he built the royal city of Meknes. It's actually his crowning achievement, and almost everything in the city of Meknes was built by Mullah Ismail. If you ever visit Morocco, I highly recommend visiting that city because sometimes it's not on the tours that are put there, because he really did a magnificent job. It's still one of the 4 royal cities of Morocco. F is true. He fought in the cities of Asila, Larash, Tangier, and a few others like Mehdia to remove either Spanish or British presence in Morocco. B is false. Although he tried to cement a relationship with Louis XIV, when the War of Spanish Succession happened and the Bourbon dynasty was installed in Spain, it was no longer tenable to pursue an alliance with France because Spain was the eternal enemy of Morocco. C is false because the relationships with the Habsburgs were not good. Despite the fact that the Austrians and the Moroccans both were opposed to the Ottomans, they couldn't coordinate together, they couldn't trust each other. And E is false. Mullah Ismail is the person with the most confirmed children of any person in history. It is confirmed that he had 888 children at a minimum. Some people believe he may have had as many as 1,100 children. So definitely more than 2 boys in there. One of the things that I want to talk about today, because this word is going to come up a lot, is the word jihad. And I want to make a clear delineation between what jihad is and what jihadism is, as we understand that today. So when we look at jihad, we're talking about a religious obligation to strive. And there are 2 types of jihad. There's what's called the greater jihad, which is a striving to purify yourself. It's an entirely personal task and is something that a religious believer does as an act of self-growth and development. And then there's the lesser jihad, which is to effect political change on behalf of the Muslims. And most religious scholars would argue that the lesser jihad includes violence, but it doesn't necessarily require it. And you have numerous scholars. I decided to put Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri here, who's one of the leading Sufi scholars Sunni Sufi scholars in Pakistan. And he has written extensively about how jihad cannot be used to justify the killing of civilians. Because of its purpose of striving against corrupt authority, civilians are clearly not corrupt authority. But what we see today in terms of the Middle Eastern world is jihadism, which is a form of Islamism, Islamism being this idea that a modern state with a theocratic element should be created. And jihadism believes that the only way to effect that is through a violent revolution. In many ways, it borrows a lot of these precepts from the Communist Manifesto, right? That you need a violent revolution to wash away the sins of democracy, the sins of empire, the sins of a number of collective things that they call jahiliyyah or ignorance. And through this revolution, they will create an Islamically compliant modern state. But you can see that there's a distinction there between that and jihad. And so many things that are acceptable in the course of a revolution that is somehow sacred in its goal to bring about a theological state, and simply violence that is used to set up one of those types of states, there's a functional distinction. Additionally, we should point out that the word jihad will be used today to refer to how the Barbary States saw that term. And the Barbary States saw jihad as giving them legitimacy in terms of going to war repeatedly with non-Muslim states. And again, there's scholarly difference of opinion as to whether it can apply in that case and whether it can't apply. And I would say that this is a situation where there are political contingencies that make it much better for these governments to support that kind of interpretation than it having any true religious basis, sort of religion in a vacuum kind of thing. For those who are curious, that on the upper right-hand side, that's a picture of the Taliban riding a tank. The Taliban are a jihadist organization, right? They believe in creating a theocratic state, a theocratic modern state, through the use of violence. And the columns below refer to the four major political movements that developed in the modern Arab world as a result of exposure to Europeans. Because we had mentioned in the Middle Ages, especially, we went over this in more detail in episode 24, that in the medieval system, you had a secular ruler on one side and a religious ruler on another side, and they worked together, both elements of the government, and they debated different issues. And those two different figureheads were, of course, removed or sublimated by the European colonialists. So there were four answers that the Arabs came to as to how to create a modern state in the Arab world in the wake of this colonization, because colonization brought them out of the medieval period into the modern period. Three of those answers said, what we should do is we should eliminate the religious leader and leave the secular leader in power, right? You have the liberals who want to create a Western style system with general democracy, human rights, these kinds of values. You have the nationalists who want to create an ethno-national state, similarly to the kinds of nationalism we discussed in episode 28, Balkan nationalism. They wanted to create something like that, either Arab nationalism, Persian nationalism, Turkish nationalism. You had this nationalism developing. You had those who believed in Arab socialism, so somewhat more of a welfare state than otherwise, but you have these sort of situations. In each case, the secular head survives. The Islamists said, no, the secular head should fall. It should be the religious person who assumes all the secular responsibilities. And that's where they come from in terms of creating a modern state according to Islamic principles. So jihadism, as we see it today, and jihad as a religious phenomenon are two distinct entities, and we should be careful not to confuse them. Okay. So I have a question in the chat. Do you see any parallel between modern Christian nationalism and jihadism? I would say that the correlation, Christian nationalism in the United States, probably the clearest delineation of that, because there are different strands, is dominionism. which is the belief that Protestant Christianity should be the official religion of the United States and laws derived from Protestantism should govern the United States. The clearest parallel between dominionism is with Islamism, right? Because dominionism doesn't sacralize violence. Dominionism believes in victory through the ballot, victory through protest, victory through any means. Violence is an acceptable form, but not the only form. And Islamism is the same way. You can win power through the ballot, you can win power through a coup d'etat, you can win power through revolution, you can win power through protest. All these different means are acceptable. So Islamism is the parallel here. I would say, though, that Islamists have a much clearer roadmap, at least from what I've seen, than dominionists have, because the Sharia is much more organized and codified than any kind of Protestant law has ever been. There are certain Protestant tenets, right, like being anti-abortion, that are pretty well ascribed to, but what is the Protestant view on loans? Not entirely clear. There's a very clear Sharia view on loans, right? So the implementation mechanism is not quite there. Comment on that is that they've created widespread doubt in the electoral system. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't require a violent revolution. That's the fundamental distinction between jihadism and other forms of theocratic tendencies. All right. So we talked last time about Moroccan history and how the Moroccans moved through this period where initially they have some conquest along their coastline, the beginning interactions with the Spanish and Portuguese, who are expanding beyond Spain and Portugal in their reconquest. And we had also discussed relatively far back in the Capriles episode, which was episode 26, that in the areas west of Egypt, you begin to see a huge level of autonomy given to the provinces. You can see those provinces that were directly ruled by the Ottomans are in green. Those ones that are in purple are ruled by autonomous leaders. We mentioned, for example, in the questions, we talked about those tax farmers, those multazims running the iltizam. And functionally speaking, the iltizam was what was in operation in a lot of these areas. So what we end up having is this situation where Constantinople is less and less in control of these areas, and they divide roughly into the modern states of Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya in terms of where those delineations are. Tunisia, we're going to talk about each one separately, but Algeria was ruled by a number of Turkish leaders related to the Janissaries who intermarried with local populations. You have a number of Turkic hereditary rulers in Tunisia. And in Libya, you have alternation between Janissaries and Turks that are not directly connected to the Janissaries. All of them within this iltizam system have an incredible degree of autonomy despite being at least nominally loyal to the Ottoman Empire. One of the things to point out is that in many cases, in order to preserve their autonomy from the Ottomans at the beginning, we had wars where these Arab leaders in the north of Africa would call the Europeans to assist them. You can see, for example, this is a case, Caliph Abdullah Muhammad V Hassan, also known as Moulay Hassan, actually asked the Spanish to intervene on his behalf to fight the Ottomans. And you can see the Spanish Navy assembling at La Goulette, which is the entry to Tunis. You can see Tunis in the back, right behind the bay. And the Spanish were able to keep the Ottomans out for a time. The Ottomans eventually came back a few decades later and took Tunisia. But the key element was that North Africans were willing to arrange different diplomatic alliances in order to preserve their autonomy from the Ottoman Empire when they could. We talked about, for example, Morocco did the same thing. The Saadians allied with the Count of Alcaudete from the Spanish side in order to remove the Wattasids who were supported by the Ottoman Empire. Here you can see here, this is al-Jaza'iri, crossing the border into Tunis and invading the country in the 1560s. The Spanish would try to reinvade, but unsuccessfully. So one of the things that we talked about when we talked about naval slavery, and we talked about this when we talked about Barbarossa in episode 24, what we saw was that you had a situation where Christian slaves were being picked up from either the southern coast of Europe, or from rival boats that were attacked in the water. And these Christian slaves would be put on the oars, right? We remember in Barbarossa's galley, we have a situation very similar to that picture from Ben-Hur, where the men would be naked. I assume for the movie they had clothes because of censorship reasons, but in reality, they would have been naked and rowing for hours on end. It was an incredibly stressful job. As I said, these were slaves. They were manacled to their positions. And in many cases, you can imagine if you are forced to stay in a certain place and you cannot do restroom style activities, the smell, the conditions for disease run rampant. They would actually flow ocean water in to try and wash out some of the detritus that had accumulated in the bottom of these boats. But regardless, it was a very hard life. Eventually, with the development of the sail, and a sail that could actually sail against the wind and be useful in naval combat, fewer and fewer slaves were put to this end. They were put instead to land uses, which in many cases were just as deplorable. You can see on the right-hand side, this is the slave market of Algiers. And one of the things you have to realize is that this piracy of stealing Christians from the southern parts of Europe was part of the economy in the Barbary States. And when I use that term, Barbary States, I'm referring to all four of the states, three within the Ottoman Empire with significant autonomy, right? That's Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And fourth, separate from the Ottoman Empire, but still similar in many respects, Morocco. So in all four of the Barbary states, we had a significant portion of the income and wealth generated for the region coming from the slave trade. And in many cases, we have situations where corsairs, who are the pirate captains, are not only legal, they are privateers, right? They have letters of marque and reprisal from the various Barbary states, which means that they sail under the Barbary state flags. They are legitimate enterprises. Not only are they part and parcel of these states in terms of their economic policy, but they're also part and parcel of their diplomatic policy. Increasingly, the Barbary states would use them as leverage to get indemnity payments from Europe, and this is the way that would work. Once a ship had been taken or a seaside area pillaged and the population enslaved, they would inform the Europeans that they had white slaves on the slave market. And then there were orders of Catholics, Mercedarians were probably the most famous, but there were orders of Catholics and Protestants that would come to these slave markets and buy or ransom these slaves back from the Algerians, Tunisians, Libyans, or Moroccans. Now, because these boats were boats that bore the flags of these different Barbary states, occasionally they would go to war, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But by and large, the policy was to steal slaves and then sell them back to Europe. Now, of course, there were many cases where this did not work out. And there are different reasons for that. So in some cases, the Europeans who came were not representing the countries whose people had been taken. We have evidence of corsairs sailing as far away from the Mediterranean as Iceland and Ireland to kidnap people and bring them to the slave markets. And we know Ireland in particular because we have a written account from one of the merchants, a European merchant who was living in Algiers, who saw an Irish family being ripped apart. Mother, a daughter, and father were all sent to different slave owners. And of course, nobody was petitioning on behalf of the Irish because the Irish in the this was in the 17th century, the Irish did not have any good representation outside of Ireland. We also have numerous cases of how those slaves actually worked. The Algerians especially, but we see it also from the Libyans, wrote extensively on how their slaves were treated, including, for example, being bolted into place at night with manacles. They were forced to mine, in many cases, dangerous conditions, especially for copper. The only kinds of slaves that we know of that did not have brutal manual labor were those that had any medical training. Doctors were in incredibly short supply within the Barbary States, and especially on the boats, they needed people to help the pirates after they had fought against rival boats. They needed doctors who could suture them up, and so anybody who had ever held a scalpel, regardless of how much expertise they had, at least tried to feign being a doctor so they would be treated better. Of course, that is not to say that they were, and while there was whipping, and the bastinado, which is a sort of a whip against the sole of the foot, while these things were used, generally speaking, you wanted your slaves to be in good form in order to continue working. So we don't have large-scale massacres of slaves, but suffice it to say, the situation was not very good for them. In the 17th century, a lot of the corsairs, because of the amount of wealth that they brought into these cities, funded the construction of mosques, fountains, and other communal works. As we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, the wealth from this dries up. And so it becomes more, the corsairs are less able to pay for such extravagances. And of course, there's the other kind of slavery that we need to mention. Women that were taken were also sold into slavery. There was a very high value, especially in the Ottoman Empire, for white women. If we remember from episode 25, the Sultanate of Women, almost all of the women in the Sultanate of Women were slaves from the Western Mediterranean. We're talking about Italians, Greeks, Spanish, and so they were considered very attractive in the Ottoman Empire, and so there was a huge business in buying and selling these female slaves in the Ottoman Empire. So, as I mentioned, you see the construction of large structures in Algeria in order to, that are based on and promoting this kind of activity. You can see, for example, this is the Kachawa Mosque. The Kachawa Mosque is in the heart of Algiers' old city. You can see behind it the Kasbah, or fortress area. And the Kachawa Mosque was used during the French colonial period as a cathedral, which is why it has sort of a cathedral shape to the top of it anyway. But this mosque was built by corsairs who had brought back significant amounts of money to Algeria. And of course, because of how much the economy was built on this piracy and on these ships, you had a large port in Algiers and in many coastal cities in the Barbary States in order for these ships to dock and to engage in their trade. But that's not the entire economy of the Barbary States. There was a significant amount of agriculture. What a lot of people forget is that the Atlas Mountain Range runs through Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And on the windward side of those mountains, that's the north and west of those mountains, because the mountains run from southwest to northeast. So on the north and western side of those mountains, closer to the coast, there is a lot of rainfall. And so it's actually quite suitable for farming and agriculture. Of course, they were using medieval methods as opposed to modern methods, so the production was low, and the populations, even as late as 1800 in these states, were around 2 million to 4 million apiece, which paled in comparison to the European numbers in the same time, but they were able to sustain themselves relatively well. The Europeans had several different responses to these issues. The first one was epitomized by the French in the 1680s, and that response was to bombard the cities and to attack in punitive raids after a significant number of ships had been boarded. Because, of course, this Corsair raiding was a negative part in all, especially Mediterranean, but all naval commerce. And the French bombarded Algiers successively throughout that 6-year period, and they won a truce. The Algerians agreed to stop attacking them for a while, but all the Barbary states made a recourse to jihad. They argued that it was their duty to fight against the unbelievers and take their wealth. Now you can see from an economic perspective why they tried to justify that, right? That this was the underpinning of their entire economy. And similar to slavery as an institution in other countries, people will twist themselves into pretzels to try and defend its moral legitimacy. In particular, during this French bombardment of Algiers, which was a full-blown war, by the way, we have a number of very interesting situations. The first is that the ruler of Algiers sent a number of captives to the French as an exchange, and among them was this name Hussein Pasha. Hussein Pasha, who would eventually get the nickname Mezzo Morto, meaning half dead, because when the French first saw him, he was half dead. He convinced the French that he could get the leader of Algiers to make peace with the French. And so the French let him go. Little did they know that Mezzo Morto actually was going to assassinate the ruler of Algeria, the Dey. Dey means uncle in Turkish, Dayı. So it was a term used for the Turkish princes in Algeria. So Mezzo Morto actually kills the Dey and installs himself as the Dey and continues the war against the French. And to show how serious he was about destroying the French, he did something that is famous and memorialized to this day, which is that he took the French consul, Jean Le Vacher, and he stuffed him into the cannon. You can see that lithograph that shows exactly that. And then he fired the cannon with pieces of Jean Le Vacher falling in every direction. Numerous other French citizens within the city were disposed of this way as a warning to the French of what would happen if throughout war against the Barbary States. There were others who decided that they could see the loss of revenue from the Corsairs as a budgetary line item. And so if they could just pay the money and avoid all the death, so much the better. And probably the first person to really engage in this was Stadtholder, Stadtholder being the title of authority for the 7 united provinces of the Netherlands. The Stadtholder, Maurice of Orange, negotiating with his Moroccan counterpart, they were able to formalize a treaty whereby the Netherlands would pay an annual indemnity, and as long as they paid that annual indemnity, no Dutch ships would be touched by the Moroccans. And other Barbary states took on that same obligation. They were more than willing to write these treaties and then violate them from time to time in order to write newer treaties and get even more money as a part of an extortion racket. Now, some states were willing to pay. Some states wanted to use punitive expeditions. But at the end of the day, even the punitive expeditions resulted in treaties, and those treaties would be subject to constant change depending on if the Barbary states needed more revenue at the time or believed they were entitled to it. However, the treaty strategy was a problem in that the corsairs were cut out of the loop. In that case, the money went straight to the Dey of Algiers. It didn't go to any of his corsairs. And so you had a lot of resistance from the corsairs to not attacking ships once the Dey had been paid off, because the corsairs needed the wealth as well. They were running a business, which is why in many cases, the Dey of Algiers or the Bey of Tunisia, or the Pasha of Libya, of Tripoli, would permit the corsairs to violate those treaties and then attack European boats that at least nominally had immunity from attack. We have a marked division between the Barbary states, especially between Morocco and the other three. And Morocco was rather different because of its last ruler in the 19th century, and in the 18th century, and that's Sidi Mohammed. Sidi Mohammed wanted to grow the Moroccan economy by trading more and more with international parties, and necessarily, if you continue to send corsairs raiding and attacking neighboring countries, those countries are going to be rather reticent to trade with you. So he was willing to negotiate treaties in good faith with Western powers, and thereby secure trade with those states. In particular, for example, he negotiated the first treaty of friendship that the United States ever signed. You can see that treaty in the upper right-hand side in both its English and Arabic versions, the English version being signed by John Adams, at that point the ambassador for the United States, and who would eventually become its second president. Sidi Mohammed also received correspondence from US President George Washington just before he died, and that US president was thanking Sidi Mohammed for serving as an intermediary with the pashas of the other Barbary states, trying to help them negotiate treaties with them. The amount of tribute that those states were asking for was extreme, especially by American ability to pay. But even though Sidi Mohammed died in 1790, his successors, including Sultan Suleiman, believed that they should maintain Sidi Mohammed's friendly relations with the United States. And in fact, with the exception of some minor diplomatic issues that we will cover, Morocco and the United States have maintained this treaty of friendship and treaty of commercial amity for up until the present day, making it one of the longest treaties of friendship between the United States and any other country. Now, we mentioned that Adams was a diplomat. There was also another diplomat, and that was Thomas Jefferson, the man who would become the third president of the United States. During the period immediately following the American Revolution and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, these American diplomats were in Europe trying to facilitate relations between the nascent United States under its Articles of Confederation and the European states. At that moment, we have a recollection from Jefferson that he was sitting by the fire and he had been invited to meet Sidi Haji Abdurrahman Aja, who was the ambassador from Tripoli to England, right? Because they were sitting in England, in London specifically, and the and the ambassador Abdurrahman basically said that the United States needed to, the United States was in an open state of war with the Barbary States. You can see the Barbary States outlined in the map there. And those Barbary states needed to be paid tribute in order to cease this kind of war. Now, the conversation could not have been stranger for the two individuals. Jefferson's view was that the United States was a country pursuing peace with all of its neighbors, and Abdurrahman was promoting the view that without a fixed treaty and tribute, there would be no peace with Tripoli. And Jefferson inquired further from Abdurrahman what his motivation and justification for such a status was. And the response that Sidi Abdurrahman gave has become immortalized in that in the way that Jefferson has retold the encounter, where Jefferson claims that Abdurrahman said that in the name of their prophet, they have permission to make war against any and all non-believers, and until they have avowed themselves of the Islamic religion, or have paid tribute and are in treaty. And so you had this concept of jihad, as Abdurrahman outlines it, that fits into the Barbary States economic model of constant piracy. Now, just to point out, piracy is not exclusively a Barbary States phenomenon, right? We've seen piracy also with the European powers. Sir Francis Drake was a committed English pirate raiding Spanish ships. And so this is not something entirely foreign to the Western consciousness, but the religious justification for it may well be. So it's worth pointing out what the relationship with Morocco looked like. The United States sent a consul to Morocco, that was James Simpson, and he was responsible for negotiating the Moroccan-United States relationship. One particularly thorny moment in that relationship was the story of the Betsy. The Betsy was an American commercial frigate that was taken over by Moroccan pirates in 1785, so before the Treaty of Amity was signed in 1787. The Moroccans rechristened it the Mashoda, and sailed it. The Americans at the time, this was 1802 when the Moroccans were sailing it, were maintaining a blockade around Morocco, and so it created a diplomatic incident. Eventually, a treaty was signed with Morocco that James Simpson concluded. It required a $20,000 one-time bribe, $20,000 of money in that time. $20,000 one-time bribe, along with a number of cannons and other hardware. Although the cannons were slow to arrive, which pissed the Moroccans off, by and large, the Moroccans were able to maintain that peace with the United States. And the Mashoda, what I believe was repatriated to the United States. And as I pointed out before, the Moroccans also assisted the Americans in negotiating with the other pashas, beys, and deys. So let's sort of bring Algiers into the present moment, into that 1800s moment. So the first thing is that, as I mentioned, Algeria was, as I mentioned in episode 25, Algeria was first taken by the Ottomans by Barbarossa, and he created what was called the Ojak of Algiers, the Regency of Algiers, and that regency, eventually there was a coup d'etat by the Janissaries that were living there, and they installed their own leadership. The eventual result of that was the creation of the Dey, or the uncle. Now, these uncles were almost exclusively from the Koulouri ethnic group. And the Koulouri is an ethnic group that really only exists in Algeria. It is the descendants of Turks and other people from the Caucasus region, like Circassians or Armenians who had been converted to Islam, and the local Berber Arab population of Algeria. It's the result of those marriages. And so these Koulouri, of course, not all of them were empowered, but all of the Deys in Algiers were Koulouri by and large. And you can see Baba Ali Sawish, Baba Ali Sawish, and Shawish was the first person to use the title Dey from 1710 to 1718. Now, you also have the case that the Deys were difficult to negotiate with because Unlike the Moroccans, who had clear autonomy and independence, the three Barbary states to the east, Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripoli, were at least nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. So you have this situation, for example, you can see in the picture in the upper right-hand side, where the Spanish are in the court of Abdulhamid I in 1784, asking to treat with the Algerians and prevent them from attacking Spanish shipping. Ottomans in the court of Abdulhamid basically say that they have no control over Algiers and that the Spanish should deal with the Algerians themselves. One of the things that I wanted to point out as well is how ethnically diverse Algeria is. You can see areas in the brown. Those are areas with large Arab and Turkish populations. You have areas in green and purple. The green areas are areas that, and the green and purple areas are indigenous Berber tribes or Kabylia. The green ones being loyal to the Beys, and the purple ones only being loyal to the one with power. It could be a Bey, it could be a foreign power. You also have the Kingdom of Kuku, which is in red, which is another Kabylia kingdom. And so within this tapestry, you have the Deys of Algeria ruling this territory, and they subdivided it into 4 different beyliks for the ease of administration. That said, they all reported to the Dey, and it was the Dey who was responsible for the foreign policy of all of Algeria. Ever since that Spanish government received the word from the Ottomans that the Algerians could be treated with as an independent country, more or less, Algeria controlled its own foreign policy. And that policy included raiding on European shipping. One of the particular raids that I wanted to highlight, because it really shows that the defeat of North Africa was not a foregone conclusion, is the war with Denmark in 1772. The Algerians had raided and attacked 11 different Danish ships. And so the Danes send 2 ships, the Falster and the Greenland. And you can see those 2 ships. The Greenland is the one on the right, the bigger ship. That's a ship of the line. And the 2 ships launched a punitive expedition against Algeria. It did some damage to the exterior walls of the port, but not significant enough. And the Danish crew also caught a virus, and many of them died at sea, leading them to conclude a treaty with Algiers in which they paid an indemnity to Algiers and returned to that sort of treaty relationship that they had previously had, but for more money, obviously. You also had the situation with Tunisia. Now, as you can see, Tunisia is just on the eastern side of the Beylik of Constantine in Algeria. And there were often Beys of Constantine who were subordinate to the Dey, right? Because, yeah, it's a regional title. Beys of Constantine who would try to enter Tunisia. Tunisia repeatedly rebuffed these attacks using cunning military strategy and a better understanding of the local tribes. So one of the Tunisians that I'd really like to talk about is Ahmad ibn Ali. He was Bey of Tunis from 1782 to 1814, so quite a long reign there. And he managed to get into a number of different skirmishes. In particular, he's well known for the Tunis-Venetian War, in which there had been cargo transported to Sfax, which is a Tunisian port city. And the crew leaving there had a number of diseases. And so when they docked in Malta, the sailors were quarantined and the cargo was destroyed. Ahmad ibn Ali demanded from the Venetians, who controlled Malta at the time, an indemnity for the destruction of this cargo, because he needed those cannons. He purchased those cannons. The Venetians kept stalling on the question of payment. The the ship was quarantined and destroyed in 1781. By 1784, Hammud ibn Ali was tired of this, and so he ordered a war against the Venetians. The Venetian Republic came together under the naval rule of Angelo Emo Capitolista, and Capitolista launched the bombardment of a number of Moroccan cities. This is a lithograph of his bombardment of Sfax, but he also hit Susa, Bizerte, Tunis, a number of different cities along the Tunisian coast. And at first, Hammud ibn Ali in 1787 had to sign a more humiliating treaty to the Venetians. But then later he was able to attack in force and took the Venetians off guard. In 1792, the Venetians on land were dealing with threats from Napoleon's army. And so they decided to write a treaty that was very conciliatory to Hammud ibn Ali, including an indemnity that was larger than they would have paid had they not gone to war in the first place. We also see that Hammud ibn Ali was a large-scale architect within Tunisia, especially in the city of Tunis, where he built the what are called the dakana, or the barracks, and these barracks exist all throughout the Kasbah, or fortified section of the city of Tunis. And you can see one of them. This is Sidi Morjani. And these barracks helped defend the city from those rival incursions from the Bey of Constantinople and other Algerian rivals. There's a question, isn't there a similar international issue happening recently somewhere in the Middle East, potential explosive cargo no one wants to pay reimbursed for? There is an issue like that, but it's not similar to this. Basically, the situation was that there was a ship in the harbor in Beirut that didn't have good papers, and so it couldn't unload its cargo. And it was stuck in a set of bureaucratic loopholes from, I mean, the functionary system, the bureaucratic system in Lebanon needs some help, I think is the nicest way to say it. They couldn't figure out how to deal with the ship, and so the ship remained in the harbor for years without being able to discharge its payload. It turns out that its payload was a number of chemical fertilizers, which are incredibly flammable and explosive. And one day, about a year and a half ago, one of those things caught fire and it exploded, taking about half of the port of Beirut with it. And so now there's a huge issue of how to compensate people for the damage that has been done to the ship, and who is supposed to be at fault. Is it the government for not doing the paperwork? Is it the ship owner for not having a proper manifest? Is it the cargo owner because they didn't organize their cargo properly? There's a number of different things, and so that's the issue. So it's a little different than this. One thing that we didn't mention when we were talking about Hammud ibn Ali is that he was also instrumental in Tripolitan politics. Now, you can see in the center, I have a map of modern Tripoli in red and green, and the map of Ottoman Tripolitania. So there are some areas of modern Libya that aren't included in the Ottoman state. And the Ottoman state at that time was ruled by a number of Turkish princes from a family called the Karamanli family. That family, Karamanli, was itself named after the Karamanids, who we talked about probably back in episode 16 or 17. There's no relation, though, with that Turkish tribe, as far as we're aware. And the Karamanids had been expelled by the Ottomans because there was almost always a tug of war between the Ottoman power base and these individualistic beys, pashas, and sultans in northern Africa. And the particular story here is rather interesting. So you can see Trabulsu Ali Pasha, or Ali Pasha from Tripoli. He came to Algeria at a young age, and then in 1790, or so, he left Algeria to go to the Ottoman Empire, where the Ottoman Empire sent him to Tripoli. The government in Istanbul sent him to Tripoli in order to become the Ottoman governor, the loyal Ottoman governor of Tripoli. And in doing so, the family of the Karamanli were kicked out. There were two brothers, Ahmed and Yusuf, and those brothers went into exile in Tunisia. Then, for the moment, Hammud ibn Ali was reticent to fight Trabulsi Ali Pasha because Trabulsi Ali Pasha had at least the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultan. Remember, Hammud Ali Bey, despite being mostly independent, is still part of the Ottoman Empire, at least nominally, and he still respects the office of the Sultan, and he also respects the title of Caliph that the Sultan holds, right? The leader of the Islamic world. So Hammud ibn Ali is reticent to fight Trabulsi Ali Pasha. That is until Trabulsi Ali Pasha launches a naval attack to the island of Jerba. You can see Jerba just off the coast of Tunisia there. And he begins occupying that island. That changes Hammud ibn Ali's position completely. And he launches an invasion of both Jerba and Tripoli, crossing the border and removing Trabulsi Ali Pasha from government. Once there, he puts Ahmed Karamanli in power, but Ahmed Karamanli is outfoxed by his own brother, Yusuf, and sent into exile in Egypt. This is just one of the instances that you could cover during this 200-year period from about 1600 to about 1800, where you had numerous fights between the Barbary states that were sort of on this knife's edge between autonomy and loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan or complete independence. Which brings us to the Barbary Wars. So, as we mentioned, the ambassador of Tripoli and later the ambassadors of Tunis and Algeria as well began demanding payments from the United States. And the payments were not insignificant. The United States budget, the national budget in the year 1800 for the United States was $11 million. Of that, $1.5 million went to pay these bribes. So that is over 10%. So you can see this is one of the biggest single line items in the entire federal budget at the time. Now, there came to be a debate between John Adams and Jefferson, those two diplomats eventually becoming presidents, where John Adams believed that the bribe should be paid because it's too difficult for the United States to maintain a navy and to go after them. Jefferson argued that a navy would be worth it in terms of it would already cost us this much money. We might as well spend that on a navy and enforce our interests against the enemies. So when Jefferson became president in 1800, he ordered a squadron of he ordered the construction of a U.S. Navy, and he sent that squadron as soon as practicable to the Mediterranean, where they began to engage with Tripoli. Tripoli declared war with the United States when they were unable to get a new treaty where the United States would pay an even bigger bribe than it had been paying before. So we have a number of particular instances that are worth highlighting from the Barbary War, which was really the first American war to be fought outside of North America. Now, one of the things is that the Americans played almost as dirty as the Tripolitanians, if we can say that. In this case, for example, if you look in the upper left-hand side, you can see a lithograph of the American ship, the Enterprise, attacking and capturing the Tripolitanian ship, the Tripoli. The way this was able to be achieved was that the Americans flew the British flag, and of course the British had a treaty standing with the Tripolitans. And oftentimes the Tripolitans would come close enough to the British ship to just talk politics and figure out where everything was and get some more information. so the Tripolitans came close to this American ship, expecting it to be a British ship. And once they were in cannon distance, the Americans pulled down the British flag, put up the American flag, and began firing. It was a decisive victory against the Tripoli and allowed the commandeering of that ship. One of the other stories that's very famous from this war there's a comment actually that in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in August 2022, there's going to be an event called Tall Ships, where they're going to reconstruct replicas that are doing this, which sounds fantastic. One of the other major things that happened in this war was that the USS frigate, the Philadelphia, ran aground, chasing a Tripolitanian ship through a narrow reef. The Tripolitanians were able to take the ship and bring it back to harbor. Now, the Americans realized that a ship of this quality could not fall into Tripolitanian hands, or it might upset the balance of power in the seas. So Lieutenant Stephen Decatur basically created a SEAL team with his naval squadron to land in Tripoli, sneak onto the boat, set it on fire, and then walk away, making sure that the ship was unseaworthy and therefore could be of no use to the Tripolitanians. It is one of the most heroic things that has been done, because of course they had no air cover, they had no secondary support. They were just going in there and hoping that their intelligence on the organization of the city was sufficient for them to get into the harbor and in and out. There's a question of when did Tripoli become Libya? Libya is the title that the country takes after the Italians colonized it in 1911. There's a couple other things that's worth mentioning to really show the extent and size of the war. The first is that it wasn't just the Americans, although the Americans were the dominant force against Tripoli. There were other combatants as well. In particular, the Swedish had sent 2 frigates to Tripoli, completely unrelated to the American errand. They were responding to Swedish cargo being seized, and so they were beginning to blockade Tripoli. The Americans joined the Swedish blockade, and together they were able to prevent any ships from leaving Tripoli for the duration of the war. Another ally here is the Kingdom of Naples. Despite having ongoing issues with Napoleon on land, the Kingdom of Naples gave shipyards, men, ships, and other crew to assist the Americans in fighting the Barbary Wars. And finally, there's another contingent. You can see in the upper right-hand side, you see William Eaton and Ahmed Karamanli, right, that deposed brother of Yusuf Karamanli. General William Eaton promised Ahmed that he would install him in Tripoli as the new Pasha of Tripoli if he would assist the Americans. And they actually fought a battle at the city of Derna in what's today eastern Libya, relatively close to Benghazi, for those of you who are more familiar with that city. And they won a key battle at Derna. However, the American negotiated a treaty at the same time with Yusuf Karamanli, which meant that Ahmed would have to go back into exile and Yusuf would retain his power. Because of these attacks, especially the one led by Decatur that burnt the USS Philadelphia, the US Marine hymn has always included "To the Shores of Tripoli," referring to the invasion of the country of Tripoli. This did not mean that all the Barbary issues were resolved. A number of issues had been resolved with Tripoli, but they hadn't been resolved with the other Barbary states. After 1805, when the treaty was signed, the United States began to be drawn more and more into the Napoleonic conflict as well. That conflict, of course, in the United States is commemorated as the War of 1812. where the English fought ostensibly on the French side. They didn't have any alliance with the French, but they both fought against the British interests. But after the War of 1812 had settled with the Treaty of Ghent, where the British and the Americans had a ceasefire, effectively, Stephen Decatur, now promoted to Commodore, returned to the Mediterranean to deal with Algeria. He was particularly known in this, and this conflict was much quicker. Instead of being 4 years, it was less than 4 weeks. The first battle, he had several of his ships surround the Mashouda. Apparently, this is a very popular name, which is an Algerian ship in this case, commanded by Rais Hamadou Ben Ali, one of the leading naval generals, naval corsairs of Algiers. And he then, and this battle takes place off the coast of Spain. Rais Hamadou is killed, but the ship is taken. There's another battle slightly after that, and the Estadio, another Algiers ship, is taken. And then in July of 1815, Stephen Decatur, on board his commanding ship, I believe it's the Ontario, he signs with the Dey of Algiers a new treaty, where the Americans would return the Mashouda and the Estadio, and they would return all 500 or so Algerian captives they had taken. The Algerians would return all 10 or so American captives they had taken. And for the first time, we see a tribute going in the other direction. Algeria is paying $10,000 to the Americans for all the shipping they have seized, and they guarantee that there will be no further issue between the United States and any of the Barbary states. This is revolutionary. And the reason that the United States was able to get a treaty that was this favorable when the European countries had not been able to do so is that the United States had created a confederation of different European powers in the Mediterranean, effectively blockaded the port cities for long enough to compel them to surrender on terms. The British were also sort of brought up in this towards the end of this Barbary War in the year 1816. And at first, Pellew, who's a British admiral, thinks he has a good treaty signed with the Algerians, but it doesn't work. So he returns in September of 1816 after the murder of 200 or so Christian slaves in the city of what was at that time called Bone, and what is today called Annaba. It's a city in the eastern part of Algeria, very close to the Tunisian border. These were Sardinians, Sicilians, and other Italians who were either living or enslaved in Algiers. Seeing that those were under his protection, he ordered the Algerians to give them up. And in order to compel this, he ordered his soldiers to fire everything they had for 9 hours in the middle of the night against the walls of Algiers. And they destroyed significant portions of the city. After 9 hours, at around 2 in the morning, he let up and he asked if the Algerians were ready to surrender. And the Algerians were, which was good for Pellew because the whole thing was at that point a bluff. He had very little ammunition. He could definitely not shoot again for any longer than that. And his fleet had been combined British, American, and Dutch, and so he couldn't be sure that he would have those alliances ever again. But in his treaty, he negotiated that 1,000 Christian slaves would be freed immediately, 3,000 would be freed later, and the ransom that had been taken from the British of about 80,000 pounds in 1816 was returned to them. Following the American precedent, the British were able to secure that they would have free trade throughout the Mediterranean. One of the things to note here is that once the Christians were no longer a major part of Algeria, because of the returns of these Christians, according to treaties like Pellew's, labor began to be shifted on the Algerian Jewish community, which was large enough to absorb some of these losses. But the loss of slaves definitely hurt the Algerian economy in the long run. it's worth, before we get to what happens in Algeria, it's worth understanding what's going on in France at this time. So in 1815, Napoleon loses the Battle of Waterloo and is subjected to the Treaty of Vienna. In this treaty, um, he is required to submit, and the Bourbon monarchy is restored, but it's restored as a constitutional monarchy. There are limits on the power that the Bourbons are able to express. The first king, Louis XVIII, understands these limits to a certain degree, not favored, he doesn't favor them, but he accepts them. His successor, Charles X, who rules from 1824 until 1830, was strongly opposed to them and did everything in his power to concretize himself as an absolute monarch of the ultra-royalist faction. This was deeply, deeply antithetical to where France was as a society by this period. And so there was a lot of negativity towards him, and especially negativity because he was beginning to siphon money away from the middle classes towards the wealthy, restoring titles of nobility, land holdings that had been taken away in the French Revolution, and other deleterious acts. As a way of saving face, in 1830, he invaded Algeria because the population was firmly supportive of that kind of nationalistic patriotic behavior. That said, no sooner had the invasion of Algeria started than there was a revolt against Charles X's rule, and he was forced into exile by the revolutionaries, who installed a liberal monarchy led by Louis Philippe. So let's go into the French seizure of Algeria in 1830. We mentioned the cause related to Charles X, but the French were, it was more than just that drew them into war with Algeria. The first thing is that when Napoleon invaded Egypt, as we discussed in episode 29, they needed significant amounts of grain in order to sustain them. And a lot of that grain came from Algeria. It was negotiated by two Jewish merchants. And those Jewish merchants managed to provide that grain, but then they needed to pay for it. And they petitioned the French government. And the French government at that time, of course, had been replaced, as I said, by that Treaty of Vienna, the Bourbon Restoration. And the Bourbon French government did not want to pay that money, especially to two foreign Jews. So what ended up happening is that those Jews, because of their standing in Algiers, were backed by the Dey himself. And so there were meetings between the Dey and the French consul, Pierre Duval, that got incredibly heated, where the Dey demanded that the French pay their debts that they owed these citizens of the Deylik. The debate got so heated in 1827 that it's reputed that the Dey took out his fly swatter fan and hit Pierre Duval in the face with it in 1827. This was so insulting that it, from the French perspective, justified the invasion and removal of sovereignty from Algeria. There were a number of battles up and down the coast. The entire invasion plan was actually invented by Napoleon. Napoleon had written it out. He never actually executed on it, but he had written it out. And so it was mostly a play by numbers for those French soldiers who won a significant significant victory at the Battle of Staweli. And because of that, the French came to terms with Hussein Dey. They basically gave him the ability to flee anywhere that he wished with his wealth and with whatever janissaries or officials wanted to go with him, which meant that Algeria was now in the hands, at least nominally, of the French. But we remember, Algeria is that mixed bag of confederacies and different relationships between Kabylia or Berber tribes and Arab tribes, different regional alliances that the Dey had only held together the four beyliks, right? And those beyliks themselves were composed of these different groups. So a victory against the Dey only meant the entry for French soldiers and the beginning of the French conquest. It could have been averted at this point, which was when Louis Philippe took power. But the thing is that the French public was firmly behind this invasion. This was one of the few things that Charles X did that they were in favor of. So Louis Philippe, and as much as his liberals would want to pull out of Algeria, were forced to stay in order to maintain their legitimacy. And as you can see from the image on the left-hand side, the French swarmed over the countryside. In fact, if you look very closely, you can see these are French trampling an Algerian cemetery. And in the early days of the war, from 1830 till about 1835, there were numerous attacks against civilians in Algeria. The French army did not acquit itself terribly well. We have numerous cases of torture, rape, brutalization, and other horrid acts that left the Algerian mind scarred and deformed from this brutalization. And because of that, the remaining Algerian population, the overwhelming majority of them, were opposed to the French rule and worked together to oppose it. So as the French moved further and further in, they really encountered two different kinds of enemies. And you can sort of see the map of Algeria at that period on the right-hand side. The area in blue is the extent of the French presence, really towards the city of Algiers and in the center. And you can see on the left side, further west, you have Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri. I'll talk about him in a bit. And on the eastern side, you have the Bay of Constantine and the territories that he controls. I'll talk about the Bey first. So you have Ahmed bin Muhammad al-Sharif, who was the Bey of Constantine, and he threw everything that he could against the French. He had a number of particularly vicious assaults against the French as they were besieging the area of around the city of Constantine, and the city of Constantine is up on a hill. So he fought every stage of the way up that hill. We have stories of Algerians trying to flee the city over a cliff using ropes. Sometimes the rope snapped, sometimes there were no ropes and people dashed themselves on the rocks below. It was a very difficult campaign, and Ahmed bin Muhammad al-Sharif did everything in his power to try and keep the French out of Constantine, which eventually failed in 1837. However, when the French arrived, they preferred to keep him in power as long as he responded to their commands. And so he retained his title, but he followed all the French orders after that point until he was finally deposed by the French in 1848. Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri was a very different sort of person. He was a Sufi monk. He was raised in one of the Zawiya. Zawiya, as you can see in the lower left-hand side, are sort of Sufi areas of gathering, especially in Northern Africa. And Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri was a very well-informed individual. He had studied with al-Fasi in Mecca in terms of Islam. And the only reason he came to lead a coalition against the French was because his father thought he was too old to do it. Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri didn't believe himself to be worthy of such a title. He soon proved himself and everyone else that he was more than worthy of it. He was honorable in combat. Both the French and both his French enemies and his allies supported him, and he was able to pull together vast coalitions, organizing under the framework of jihad, arguing that the French were killing and torturing innocent civilians throughout the Algerian countryside, and that it was the duty of every pious Muslim to strive and protect the Algerian people as best they could. He was willing to negotiate with the French, and at certain points, the French even left him alone, provided he could maintain peace or stability in the area. But eventually, he got too powerful for them, and they fought him repeatedly for 15 years throughout Algeria, finally defeating him in 1847. When he surrendered, he asked to go into exile somewhere in the Ottoman Empire. His captors agreed. The French government did not. And so it wasn't until Napoleon III ascended the French, ascended power in France with the dawning of the Second Republic in 1848, that there was a decision made to allow him to go freely to the Middle East. And you can see this picture from 1860, where he distinguished himself by protecting Christians fleeing from violent Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, Druze, in Lebanon. And because of this, he has received the Medals of Honor from France, the country against which he strove so many years to fight. The defeat of Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri couldn't have happened without Morocco. And Morocco was actually originally on the side of Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri in his attacks against the French, but the French began to bombard key places in Morocco: Isli, Tangier, and Mogador. Mogador is the modern-day city of Essaouira. And that French bombardment led the Alawite leaders to decide that they would turn on Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri and force him out of Moroccan territory in order to preserve their power. That said, Moroccans as a people were deeply sympathetic with Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri, and there were riots throughout the country that almost cost the Alawite dynasty their power anyway. But from this point forward, Morocco sort of stays out of our tale because Morocco is able to use its trade connections with the United States and increasingly with the United Kingdom to keep Spain and France, the two dominant wannabe colonizers of Morocco, from effectively taking more territory in Morocco than the two port cities that Spain still held, Ceuta and Melilla. So as the French began to organize Algeria in the 1840s, they began to develop the department system. Now, France, metropolitan France, is divided into what are called départements, or departments, and these departments each have a representative in the national parliament, the Assemblée Nationale, and in the Senate, right, the Senate. Algeria was divided into, in the beginning, 3 departments. As the war against the Sahara would continue up until the early 1900s, there would finally be 7 departments in Algeria. And this is important to note because this is the only quote unquote French colony that was not administered as a colony or a protectorate. It was administered as an integral part of the French state, in much the same way that Hawaii today is an integral part of the United States. That said, there's a slight difference between Algeria and Hawaii in that most of the population of Algeria was still Algerian. Most of the population of Hawaii is not indigenous Hawaiian anymore. There was an attempt to colonize that region of Algeria with French speaking people from France, and these were called the Pieds Noirs, or the Blackfeet. You can see that's Albert Camus. Of course, he didn't live during this century. He lived in the 20th century, but he was a Pieds Noirs. You can see typical French features because they're entirely French, and they lived in their own isolated cities along the coast, especially in the cities of Algiers and Bonn and Oran. But by and large, you had a significant portion, around 4 million people in 1830, who were ethnic Algerians. There was a small Jewish community in Algeria, but by and large, the majority of the indigenous population was Muslim. Now, in order to organize this system, the French needed a way of understanding the administration of Algeria, so that way it could retain acceptable French culture for the Pieds Noirs, and at the same time not create increased resistance from the indigenous population, who were significantly more numerous. And the result of this was le Code de l'Indigénat, also called just Indigénat. And the Indigénat was a system generally of criminal penalties, but also policies of administration that held that those people who were considered indigènes, or indigenous peoples, would be subject to their own laws and treatment. They would exist outside of the French system, although France would have a heavy hand in administering those traditional forms of justice. This meant that Algerians would not have to convert from Islam into Christianity and become French citizens. they could stay Algerian Muslims. They would simply have fewer rights than the French did. Now, L'Indigena also was responsible for this legal inequality between Muslims and Christians, and was thoroughly implemented in the 1880s. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that the French were consistently worried that Algeria might have a rebellion. And one particularly bad time for that was in 1870 because of the Franco-Prussian War. France being defeated by Germany in significant battles meant that hope was given to the Algerian people that they could rise up and defeat the French. So Adolphe Cremieux, who was the Justice Minister of the Third Republic of France, which was the operating government after the Battle of the Sedan, in which Napoleon III of France was captured, he thought that an easier way of creating a large number of effective pieds noirs in Algeria was to issue a decree in 1870 that would turn all of the Algerian Jewish population into French citizens. Because previously Jews and Muslims in Algeria had permission to apply for citizenry, but fewer than had done so. But this way, all the Jews were now French citizens and therefore had a stake in France. There was a degree of Orientalism that those Jews faced from their Jewish compatriots in France. The Alliance Israélite Universelle and other French Jewish organizations worked to, quote, modernize the Jewish communities of Algiers and the other places in Algeria. They believed them to be ideologically backward, and they didn't have respect for the differences and nuances between the Sephardi traditions of Northern Africa and the Ashkenazi traditions of France. That said, over the decades, the Jews became increasingly integrated with the Pieds Noirs because of their different status and their relationships with these Ashkenazi Jewish organizations based in France. There was indeed a rebellion that started in 1871, led by Boumezrag al-Mokrani and his brother, which is why it's called the Mokrani Revolt. It was a devastating revolt and occurred in nearly every place in settled Algeria. Every place on the map that is in gray was either under Mokrani control or was a place where Mokranis fought the French authorities. It took the creation of the French Foreign Legion in order to stop them. And you can see the French Foreign Legion up here on the upper right-hand side. The French Foreign Legion had been created as early as 1836. And the reason for its creation is that you had numerous soldiers from all parts of the world that had fought in Napoleon's armies. Yeah, now those soldiers could cause problems in France if they were brought back to France. And also the French government didn't want to give them French citizenship. So they called them the Foreign Legion. They were all those foreign fighters, and they began to cut their teeth on Algeria, fighting revolts like the Al-Mokrani revolt and putting down those Algerians who had issues with the indigenat system and their degradation under it. There's a point that Yves Saint Laurent was Pieds Noirs. That's true. There are lots of Pieds Noirs who became very famous French individuals. Albert Camus and Derrida are probably the most famous ones, along with Yves Saint Laurent. But it wasn't just the French Foreign Legion that was coming to Algeria. There were Algerians increasingly who were loyal to the French government and French governing authorities, either from a emotional reason or more likely from an economic reason. And so the French began to recruit Algerians into the French military. They had a number of distinct organs. One of them was called the tirailleur, which was a rifle holding group of Algerians. You also had the zouaves, which were a little bit more light infantry. The Zouaves are probably the most famous of the Algerian soldiers that fought. And between the tirailleurs and the Zouaves, they were sent all across the French Empire. You can see this is actually a picture from 1885 of Zouaves boarding boats in the port of Algiers, headed towards Tonkin. That's the Tonkin in northern Vietnam, because that was part of the French colony of Indochine. We also have Zouaves going into the west when France invaded Mexico in 1863 to install the Second Mexican Empire. Zouaves and tirailleurs were both sent to Mexico as part of the French shock troops there. Ironically, as we pointed out, the Zouaves, because they spoke Arabic, were able to communicate with the Black Sudanese soldiers that Said Pasha of Egypt had sent due to his alliance with the French. There's a question of if these Zouaves are related to the Zouaves who fought in the US Civil War. If anybody knows, please put in the comments. My intuition would be to say yes. You had a number of mercenaries from different sides that were purchased to fight in the US Civil War. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Zouaves were used in this way as well. One of the things that people often forget about these colonial empires, the French, the British, during the imperialist period, is that significant portions of their military were made of indigenous peoples of other parts of the empire. And so you have remarkable stories, for example, of Algerian soldiers in World War II that were liberating concentration camps in France or in Belgium. You have stories of indigenous troops from the heart of Africa fighting in Vietnam. So these empires moved people all around the planet. Okay, somebody clarified the US Zouaves were US troops who dressed in the same uniforms as the Zouave from Algeria. Thank you. All right, so now we talked about Algiers, which effectively became a French state. Now we're going to turn our attention to Tripoli. Now Yusuf Karamanli ruled the territory until he died in 1832. He was succeeded by one of his brothers, who ruled until 1835. But there was huge economic disarray within Libya. And this led to Sultan Mahmud II of the Ottoman Empire being able to send a governor to Tripoli, and to bring Tripoli back into the Ottoman Empire. And you can see even as late as 1906, in fact, up until 1911, when the Italians would invade, Tripoli was part of the Ottoman Empire, unlike Tunis, Algeria, and of course, Egypt and Morocco were fully independent by this point. The Ottoman Empire, when they ruled the territory, had to contend with a very interesting power, which were the Senussi. Similar to Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri, the Senussi were Sufis who grew up in a zawiya. Originally, the zawiya was along the coast near Siwa, but they moved further inland as the Ottoman pashas became more entrenched along the coastline, eventually settling on the city of Jaghbub. The city of Jaghbub, as you can see in the upper right-hand side, that's a picture from the early 1940s, no longer exists because Gaddafi did everything in his power to destroy this Sufi order, including the demolition of this city. But you can see in the center the white zawiya from which Muhammad ibn Ali as-Senussi taught his new strain of Islam. So al-Senussi was decreed as a heretic by the Ottomans because he refused to align his Sufi order to any of the official schools of jurisprudence. He believed that these schools of jurisprudence didn't reflect the cultural sensitivities of the people and weren't effective. And at the same time, he disagreed with a number of the more, we can say, Wahhabist movements or Salafist movements, because he believed that those were too disconnected from the history of the Muslim people as well. And so he tried to create a cultural fraternity within Libya. Now, elements of the Senussid Sufi movement exist outside of Libya, but in Libya, they actually wielded political power. It was Muhammad's will and the will of his successors including his sons and grandsons, that the Libyan people have a strong agricultural sense, have a functioning economy, and could sell and barter things with the Ottoman government. And so there were strong relations actually between the Ottomans ruling in Tripoli along the coast and the Senussis further inland. That said, the Senussis did have a military front, and it was them who prevented the French from invading from the south. If you look at the map of Senussid power, you can see it extends further south than the current borders of Libya, all the way to areas that are in today part of Chad. Chad eventually became part of the French Empire, invading from the south as the Senussids became weaker and weaker. But the French were never able to take southern Libya because of the Senussids who fought at their tail. And finally, the last group that we want to talk about are the Tunisians. So Tunisia took a page out of the Ottoman and Egyptian books and wanted to start to modernize under their Bey, Ahmed ibn Mustafa, in 1837. And they began to build numerous engines that would do that. And they were led by their chief financier, Mustafa Khaznadar, who served as Grand Vizier and Treasurer of the increasingly independent Tunisian state. Now, it may be interesting to note, if you remember from episode 28, during the Balkan revolutions, there was a massacre on the island of Chios of the Greek population there by the Ottoman Turks. Mustafa Khaznadar was actually one of the Greeks who survived that massacre. He was converted to Islam and brought into the service of Ahmed ibn Mustafa. And so there he was able to rise in the ranks and become an officer in his court. He never forgot his Greek roots, though, and helped two of his nephews attend higher education, finding them later in life. Now, Ahmed ibn Mustafa saw the way that industrialization had worked in Egypt and in the Ottoman Empire and began to spend money on doing exactly the same thing. You can see the Al-Batan Bridge, which is one of the first water-powered mills in the Islamic world. The mill is actually in the rivulets of the bridge, and that powered a number of textile looms inside the buildings in the far part of the photograph. Now, eventually, those would be replaced with English steam engines when that technology became available. There was also the construction of iron foundries and cannon foundries in the Bardo, which is very close to Tunis. And you have the creation of modern grain silos and other massive economic improvements. But what was really the most important thing to Ahmad ibn Mustafa was creating a modern military. And so he built the Bardo Military Academy, very close to the National Palace. And at the Bardo, he managed to train enough soldiers that 40,000 Tunisian soldiers were sent to the Ottoman Empire to assist in 1853 with the Crimean War. Ahmed also expanded the bureaucracy. He created numerous different departments of the government to run all of the different aspects of the industry that he was creating, including a ministry for the Tunisian forests. This required an incredible amount of money, most of which was not spent terribly wisely, and required increasing loans in order to front the cost. Additionally, money was spent on things that showed a clear lack, as we would say, of proper preparation or thought-throughness. One of them was that, if you remember from the earlier slides, you can see the Goulet, which connects Tunis to the Mediterranean, is separated by this narrow corridor. He built a ship in the Goulet, in that area close to Tunis, and didn't realize that it would get stuck. It looked like this on the lower left-hand side, where the ship was effectively stuck and unable to be properly mobilized. Another waste of his money was in building a palace at Mohammedia. You can see the ruins of that palace in the picture. But Tunisia was spending money it really didn't have. And so we see additional reforms going into effect. The first major reform is the new Mejba taxes, which were implemented by Ahmed Bey's successor, Muhammad III as-Sadiq. Somebody's asking, that's the ship that was stuck last year. That is the ship that was stuck last year. I was using it to illustrate the point, but but basically, yeah, it was a ship of the line that was stuck in there. And somebody else is pointing out that Jeddah had a large Jewish population, and that's absolutely true. There's still a Jewish population on Jeddah. The synagogue is still operative, although the population is very small. Now, Muhammad III as-Sadiq instituted new Mejba taxes. Now, we don't know how big or how effectively the original Mejba was implemented, but we know that it was similar to tax farming, where an entire family was responsible for a certain amount of taxes, and they would be paid. The new Mejba was assigned individually. The Tunisians had begun formal censuses, and the amount required was the equivalent of 45 days of labor per year, which was incredibly onerous on these populations, which caused increasing resentment. Add to this that now that censuses had been conducted and the new military created, national conscription became part of Tunisia, which of course further increased animosity. There were a number of French firms that became increasingly connected with Tunisia, while the Tunisians had done everything in their power to prevent France from having an excuse to invade from Algeria into Tunisia. They had been giving France a number of concessions, especially as concerns telegrams, aqueduct construction, and other modernization projects. But eventually, the loans that have been taken out were even too big for the money lenders within Tunisia to handle. And so Mohammed Khaznadar basically requested that Muhammad III as-Sadiq take a foreign loan, and he did, from Frederic Emile Baron d'Aranger for 35 million French francs, an amount that really Muhammad III could not afford to pay back in the long run. With all these mounting loans, Muhammad III tried to demonstrate that he was in favor of the Western powers, and wanted to create a Tunisia that would be friendly to them as well. And so he promulgated the Constitution of 1861, which allowed Jews, Christians, which meant foreigners basically, to buy and sell land. He also divided the government into independent legislative, judicial, and executive. Of course, he was the executive branches. And this constitution was celebrated in Europe and reviled by many Tunisians, as it gave foreigners rights that Tunisians believe that they have. This, of course, led to the Mejba revolt. And this Mejba revolt resulted in 4 countries really trying to take control of Tunisia. The British, French, Italians, and Ottomans, all sending their representatives. The British and French did not want the Italians to take Tunisia, and so they worked together to prevent that. But the British didn't want the French to take it either if they could wing it. And so all 3 of those forces avoided putting troops on the soil. Sadiq Bey was willing to listen to the Ottoman offer, but the Ottoman offer was too close to reabsorption for even the British consuls to promote, so they refused that as well. And this was a revolt. This revolt by the local population was eventually crushed by General Zarruq under the leadership of Sadiq Bey. And finally, this leads to the protectorate. In 1869, an international financial commission was put together by the British, French, and Italians to control the debt coming out of Tunisia once Tunisia could no longer pay. Coming out of the Mejba revolt, they were even further in debt. And eventually, what ended up happening is that in 1881, there was a small crossing of a Tunisian Berber tribe into Algeria. France used that as provocation to invade, and the Italians were too slow to beat the French to the punch. And so when they saw the French soldiers already in Tunisia, they refused to fight. In 1881, Sadiq Bey signed the Treaty of Bardo, and in 1883, there was a following treaty. These two treaties in 1881 and 1883 resulted in the French taking both external control of Tunisia's relations and internal control of Tunisia's architecture, using resident generals who would be the mouthpieces of the French government to the Bey, and a protectorate was created. Those protectorates even had their own secular Tunisian courts for Christians, so that they would not have to go to Tunisian courts, in a similar replication of the indigenous system, even though Tunisia was not a French territory and therefore could not directly implement the indigenous. So, and that is it. Questions, comments, concerns? Thank you, everybody, for the kind words. All right, so I'm going to sort of talk about the upcoming schedule. This series is on hiatus for 3 weeks. We will reconvene on the 5th of May. When we reconvene, we will have 2 sessions on Persia through the 18th and 19th centuries to sort of catch us up on the Persian side of this. We will also have a European Union meeting on the 24th. That's a Sunday of April. Where we talk about the security situation of the European Union. And we will also have a meeting on Ukraine in early May. I believe it's May 7th, whatever that Sunday is. And it will be similar to the Ukraine meetings we've had before. I have a question of whether I teach at a university. I'm not an accredited person. I'm a lay person. I'm a lawyer by training, so I actually don't teach because I wouldn't have the credentials to do it. There's a question about Afghanistan. I absolutely will cover Afghanistan. It's in the list of things that we will eventually get to. But Afghanistan is really hard to explain. And when, of course, we get to the 20th century, that's when a lot of the best Afghan history happens. There's also some great stuff in the 19th century. But 19th and 20th centuries are really where this stuff shines. And so when we get there in that part of the world, we'll hear more about that. In fact, when we talk about Persia on May 5th, that will be, we'll start that day with the Hotaki Empire, which was an Afghan empire that conquered Iran. So a little bit of Afghanistan there, to what your appetite, I guess. There's an argument that the 10 lost tribes of Israel are in Afghanistan, and somebody's bringing that up in the comments. There's a lot of different groups that claim descendants from the 10 lost tribes. I'm not terribly convinced that the Afghan claim is at all reasonable. Most of the people from the 10 lost tribes, at least as far as we can guess archaeologically, would be the modern populations in Iraq or in Syria or in Lebanon, the areas of the Assyrian Empire where they would have been dispersed to. Somebody asked about my origins. It's on the internet, so it doesn't bother me to say it. I'm an Iraqi Jew. My family came from Baghdad to the United States about 70 years ago. And yeah, that's my history. All right. Good night, everybody. And I'll see you in 3 weeks, if not sooner. All right. Bye.